Well, it's all very interesting, isn't it? Because the numbers today are far worse than when we got rid of Liz Truss, right? When she was booted out. Far worse under Keir Starmer. It's all about the gilts. I know that they sound really boring, but they're not. There's no headlines in the newspapers, little bit of talk in the financial press, no IMF outrage, no markets in crisis. Well, I thought we'd have a look at why. And let's find out about debt. Stop yawning at the back, right? You need to know this stuff. It's not even boring. It's going to be great. So what are gilts? Well, for those of you that don't know, and by the way, it's really completely fine not to know what these things are because it's not like the government or the paper or school ever taught about this stuff, right? But gilts are just government IOUs. When Britain needs to raise money, it doesn't just ring up the Bank of England or the World Bank. It has a special department called the Treasury's Debt Management Office. Yeah, they actually have an entire office to look after our debt, right? And they hold auctions. So when we need to borrow money, let's say we need £10 billion. They put it out to the market and say, what's your price for us to borrow £10 billion? And pension funds, banks, even foreign governments all pile in and they say, well, we'll lend you money and this is the interest rate we want. So it could be 4.5% over 10 years, or it could be like close to 5.9% if you want to borrow over 30 years. Hello, Starmer. Anyway, the interest rate of, say, 5.9% is called a gilt yield. And the yield is basically the price of Britain's mortgage. That's our debt. The higher it goes, the more expensive it is to keep borrowing. And remember, we have to borrow every single day just to keep the country running. It's mental. Anyway, right now, Britain's long-term borrowing costs are some of the highest across the G7. Labour likes to brag about how well we're doing against the G7. Well, they did, because we're not. But before we go on, I just want to talk a little bit about the history of Britain's borrowing and where it came from. So we've been doing it for over 300 years, and the name gilt comes from the gold edges of the old paper certificates. Gilt-edged, right? They were safe and reliable if they had those gilt edges on. But of course, they were only safe and reliable for the lenders. And right back in 1693, William III needed cash to fight France. Brilliant. At least he had the balls to do so. And Parliament invented long-term debt. A year later, merchants, bankers, business people lent him 1.2 million at 8% interest, and they founded the Bank of England, so that they could fleece him properly in a more organised way. By the 1750s, the government had come up with something brilliant called consols to fund the Napoleonic Wars. Now, these were bonds, basically the same as the gilts, but they never actually got paid back. The government just paid back interest forever. So the politicians got endless war money and bankers got endless income. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And then came the World Wars. And again, these were paid for by gilts. In fact, some World War I and Napoleonic War debt, although that has been rearranged, wasn't fully paid off until 2015. Wow. And today, Britain's debt sits somewhere between 2.7 and 3.2 trillion, depending on how you count it. Debt to all sorts of people, all sorts of countries. We owe shitloads of money everywhere. Almost as much as everything our economy produces in the course of a year. And if you add in pension promises and future liabilities, the bill's probably way higher. Anyway, back to Liz. Liz announced her mini budget. She tried an old capitalist market idea. I know, surprising. She's a conservative. And her idea was cut taxes, let people keep more of their own money, particularly to spend in businesses and on businesses, because it would spur investment and growth, right? It had been tried before. It really wasn't that rebellious. It had even been done under Blair and Brown, not only the Tories. But here's the bit. She didn't show the Office of Budget Responsibility. Now, that's a quango. It's supposed to be independent, and it, alongside the Treasury, owns this, and yeah, it probably still is an Excel spreadsheet, the budget. And they sign off the numbers. Yep, everything she's put in here is right, we'll sign it off. But Liz knew that the quango of the OBR was part of the problem. They would refuse to sign off bold new plans, even from a prime minister. The problem was that without that stamp of approval, the markets assumed the worst. They assumed she was hiding a massive black hole. And they, of course, took the opportunity to not say that it wasn't hiding a black hole. I mean, who needs external enemies when you've got them right in your midst, right? On the OBR not giving the plan its backing, mostly because it hadn't seen it in advance, the markets panicked. They saw the short-term revenue hit and thought it would be long-term, and they assumed borrowing would explode, and the yields jumped, prices fell. You remember how they work, right? And it was all carnage. But hidden in it was a bit that they didn't bother to tell anyone, not for a few months, way after she'd been pushed, and that was UK pension funds. Stop yawning. Now, these were stuffed with something called LDIs, liability-driven investments. Right, these are just gigantic bets, complex bets that gilt prices would stay steady. Because they basically always do, right? They always like trickle along like this. It's a safe bet. If you've got a pension, you've got some of it in gilts. Anyway, when prices fell, all those bets collapsed. And, you know, the banks just phoned up the pension funds and said, you need to pay us now. You need to pay all your gambling debts because you got it wrong. Soz. And the pensions didn't have that amount of cash, and they were forced to sell those gilts in a fire sale, which made the prices fall. Oversupply? Yeah, prices go down. And within days, the whole system was at risk of imploding, and only an emergency bailout from the Bank of England stopped it. Brilliant. And where did they get that emergency money from? Well, they printed it, an old favourite. They promised to buy gilts for 2 weeks up to £95 billion worth. In the end, it wasn't that bad, and they only had to spend 19 billion. But what the system showed is that it can only survive if the Bank of England keeps creating money in order to paper over its own fuck-ups. The Bank of England later admitted it had underestimated the poor management of many pension funds. I need to check if mine's one of those. But it was too late for Liz. She was the perfect fall chick. They all blamed her. They still blame her. Left-wing journalists blame her all the time, probably because they don't actually understand what happened, which is annoying. The pyramid of lenders had spoken and the media piled on. And she was gone in weeks, not because her ideas had failed, but because she wasn't even allowed to try. So why does Starmer get a free pass then? Because at the moment, UK gilt yields are far higher under Starmer than they were under Truss. What's happened? Well, it's because Starmer plays by their rules. His policies are globalist, net zero aligned, high spending, high taxation, Agenda 2030 friendly, And the markets and institutions feel safe with that, feel safe with him because of the trillions they have invested in all of those areas. They don't feel safe because the numbers are better, but because continuity of the narrative is. And how much control then do these external banking forces have? Well, a lot. And I've covered this before in the video here. If you're interested in the banking and how that works, click it. At the top, it's the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, the Bank of International Settlements, and then in the middle, global investors, sovereign wealth funds, central banks, pension funds, insurance giants, and at the bottom is your local bank and you, the taxpayer. You pay the interest on all the loans the Debt Management Office arranges through higher taxes. Yeah? The Bank of England protects the Debt Management Office, and to some extent the OBR. It doesn't matter how much they get wrong, and they get a lot wrong all the time. And if an elected government tries something outside of the norm, or something that the pyramid of banks won't like, then the markets veto it. And this is what really pisses me off, right? Much more than the truth itself, which pisses me off. What pisses me off much more are the lies. Because Labour, the Lib Dems and the Greens say higher taxes will fix the debt. That's wrong. Even the ideologues know that's wrong. Higher taxes slow growth. Look around you, look at what's happening. Now, the Conservatives say debt must come down. But if they deviate from the globalist playbook in any way, as Liz did, they panic, they back off, and they can't do what they promise anyway. And Reform UK, well, they promise radical cuts and radical changes. Maybe. But the pyramid would still veto them unless the debt itself falls. Are you going to vote for a party that wants to cut spending by 50%? Because the truth is, our debt is so huge and growing that we have very little capacity, I would actually say none, to do anything radical at all until we pay it off. You can't tax your way out of debt, and you can't borrow your way out of this amount of debt. And even worse, since Britain signed that pesky UN Agenda 30 in 2015, government departments align with sustainability goals, even the Debt Management Office, which is why we now have Green Gilts, IOUs tied to UN climate markets, ESG, and net zero frameworks. Just another layer of control handed to unelected, non-tax-paying bodies like the UN. So what's the answer, Bernie, you doom-monger? As I see it, our massive, unsustainable debt only begins to fall in two ways. One of two ways. Either one, magical growth, the kind of explosive boom you get only in wartime, and then domestic spending cuts, so slashing government budgets in half, austerity on acid. Back to that problem again. Any party that tells the truth about cutting spending will never be elected because half of the population, and growing, depends on government income, benefits, pensions, subsidies, public sector wages. Right, if we really cared, if we really did, we'd back a party that promised to halve spending. But we won't. So maybe it isn't just all the politicians' fault. Maybe it's also ours. Because until Britain cuts its debt to a level where lenders don't hold us hostage, no party, left, right, or radical, can deliver real change. Debt is the leash. Right, well, that was depressing. Anyway, now you know. Don't tell me I don't tell you stuff. What do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and like and subscribe. I tell you what we'll do. We'll also do the OBR. That's a fantastic department. It's really appalling. Until next time.